Well, thank you so much, Eric, for joining us. For those that aren't familiar with your incredible work, I got first turned onto your work through your incredible books on perennial vegetables, the edible forest drawdowns, and the carbon farming solution. You are a senior fellow and contributor for Drawdown, a lecturer at Yale University, and international trainer. And you have been studying these useful plants and tree crops for over 2 decades. And you also live this in managing an urban farm project. So thank you so much for being here and for sharing your knowledge with our funding community. And feel free to add anything I missed in your bio, but
Well, that's great. No, I'm happy to be here, and thanks for funding the planting of trees.
Wonderful. So to kick us off, it would be really supportive to our learning here if you could share, especially from your drawdown and analysis, kind of what is the big picture here on the climate perspective, not to reduce it too much to a carbon reductionist framework, but thinking about silvopasture, intercropping, perennial staple crops, kind of what is the big picture for trees and climate change?
Sure. A lot of the most powerful mitigation solutions are tree-based solutions. So at Drawdown, one of our very top solutions was tropical forest restoration, for example. Our highest agricultural solution is silvopasture, which is planting trees and pastures. So the tree-based solutions are big, and in the overall picture at Drawdown from our latest version, about 13% of the total mitigation potential in the scenario that gets us to keep warming at 1.5 degrees, about 13% of that comes from tree planting solutions. So restoring temperate and tropical forests, silvopasture, multi-strata agroforestry, tree intercropping, and perennial staple crops. So it's big, it's really big. The carbon sequestration potential is very powerful, and they also have all these other great co-benefits, which we'll get into also.
So maybe you could take us there and talk a little bit about what is cascading benefits and what is the potential, especially from a climate justice perspective?
Sure. First off, most of my, I'll talk, I think, about smallholders mostly. I know you've talked about some of the other contexts. We have some, I want to say it's about 500 million smallholders around the world who are farmers with very small operations, usually less than 2 hectares, which is about 5 acres. So very small amount of land on which to grow your food and make your living and so on. And trees, the various kinds of tree planting initiatives that can be incorporated with their crop production and livestock production in those systems can increase productivity. So they can increase the yield of the crops you're already growing. They can provide additional crops and other kinds of products like fodder for livestock and so on. They also can make a big difference in resilience in terms of adapting to climate change. So one, just by diversifying the mix of crops you have, with some of those crops are trees, they, when something challenging happens, when a weather event happens, some things survive and some don't. So if you have more diversity, you have more things to fall back on. But also we found that, some of these agroforestry systems, which integrate trees in farming in various ways, increase water holding capacity dramatically to make it possible to survive dry periods better. Some of them produce food or fodder for livestock well into the tropical dry seasons. So they extend the season of food production in a really important way. They also often produce a lot of biomass as a waste product, which can be used for cooking. And to the degree that every hectare of agroforestry prevents the deforestation of something like 10 hectares of land, the degradation of about 10 hectares of forest, because you are producing so many prunings that you can use those to cook. And some 3 billion people in the world are cooking with wood at this point. So that's a very important side benefit. There's a number of other ones too, but there are real benefits to the farm and to the farmer of adopting trees in their farming systems, if they get the right species and they're planted in the right way and so on.
Maybe this would be a good moment for you to share a little bit about your nonprofit and some of the potential to realize these benefits of these cascading benefits and some of the research needed to really realize that.
Sure. My new entity is called the Perennial Agriculture Institute, and our first product, which will be out any day now, is a paper being published in a really big scientific journal looking at the nutritional value of various kinds of vegetables, of every kind of vegetable for which data was available. So over 300 species of vegetables. And what we found is that in terms of the nutrients that are most needed to address both traditional malnutrition and also the deficiencies associated with the industrialized diet. And those have sort of different nutrients that they need. But in both cases, the vegetables with the best ability to address those deficiencies are trees with edible leaves. So there's a very strong case to be made for trees with edible leaves. We have them for most climates where farming happens. They're not only limited to the tropics, but very much for temperate and even dry temperate climates. So I think there's a real argument to be made for scaling up the planting of tree vegetables as a nutrition issue for addressing some of these very serious deficiencies that impact again, about 3 billion people around the world. So very big scale challenges that trees can help to address.
Amazing. And just for folks on the call that may not be as familiar with some of these amazing species like moringa, could you give a few other examples just to ground it for people?
Sure. Moringa is probably the one that's most popular. Baobab leaf is becoming more of a big deal. In cold climates, it would be edible leaf goji and Chinese tun and edible leaf mulberry. One could go on and on. I identify in the paper about 70 or 80 species of trees that are cultivated for edible leaves around the world. And then there are many, many more that are edible but not cultivated that are also worthy of looking and cultivating. So there's a really astonishing biodiversity of edible trees that we're far from taking full advantage of.
Thank you so much for doing that work and that research, Eric. So you've already touched on a couple of the really important kind of climate justice pieces about trees. Obviously nutrition in terms of the world's malnutrition and people not having access to adequate nutrients. You've talked about cooking fuel and just access to meeting those daily needs in ways that are supportive of health and well-being of the ecosystems within which people abide. Could you talk a little bit more about kind of the macro picture of like what is coming down in terms of climate impacts on the world's most on frontline communities and how can trees help to address this?
Sure. Well, right. The main reason to me to mitigate climate change, to keep warming to 1.5 degrees, is the impacts on people. And we see the sort of context is that the people who are doing the least to cause the problem are the ones who are most affected. So we have a disproportionate responsibility and a disproportionate impact, all of which targets the world's poorest countries and people of color within countries and countries that are mostly made up of folks of color. So we see like the worst impacts in fisheries are in the tropics. So less fish to eat. We see the biggest impacts on food security in the tropics, places like Haiti, places like the Sahel region of Africa, where food security is already precarious and some of the infrastructure is not real strong. But also those are the places where the biophysical impacts of climate change are most powerful. We see spreading of diseases like malaria spreading its range within the United States, well into the Gulf Coast and southeastern United States. We're projected to see a lot more malaria. And these are regions with large African American populations. We see the number of people likely to be displaced by climate change. In 2050, we estimate 1 in 45 people in the world will be on the move and have had to leave their home, whether it's within their countries or going between countries. And migration is already one of the places where people are most vulnerable to human trafficking and modern slavery. So when you're looking at a great increase in the number of people who are likely to be on the move, you're looking at a very large number of people much more vulnerable to human trafficking and modern slavery. So these are very serious reasons that tree planting as part of a mitigation effort helps to slow those things. And then finally, conflict. At a 2-degree warming, in a 2-degree warming world, almost 3 billion people are at a heightened risk of conflict in their country. And again, that's largely in the world's tropics. So there are a number of very, very real human rights challenges that mitigating climate change can prevent. And there are some ways in which tree planting can help to sort of adapt to a few of those things, but most in like food security, for example, it can make a really big difference in that area, but doesn't directly help tropical fisheries so much unless they're mangroves, in which case there very much is a big help there. But tree planting doesn't necessarily prevent conflict or migration or malaria or things like that, but it makes the world where those things get so much worse not happen. So that's a really important motivation.
It's a really important motivation for the timing, right?
Yeah, we have, a decade, maybe a decade and a half or so to really dramatically change our emissions profile. Really, really dramatically. So by maybe 2030 or so, we want to see things at about a 50% reduction from where they are now. Reduction of emissions, and biosequestration from trees can play some role in helping to reach that goal.
So you mentioned that 13% kind of drawdown contribution of trees generally. One of the things that sometimes we hear as a point of confusion is the relationship between conservation and afforestation or reforestation, and a curiosity around which is more important. And I'm wondering if you could maybe nuance that a little bit for us and help us understand how to hold that question, whether we obviously both are important. So how do we kind of hold thinking about tree growing as new trees in the context of all the conservation that's needed?
Sure. Yeah, both are important. The way that that we think about that at Drawdown is, on the one hand, preventing deforestation and forest degradation is preventing emissions. So those forests represent huge stocks of carbon. They're holding all this carbon in their soil and in their biomass. And we want to prevent those emissions, whereas new growing trees are sequestering carbon. And the way that John Foley over at Drawdown talks about this is, he says, imagine that your bathroom sink is overflowing, your bathroom faucet is overflowing, water is spilling out onto the floor. The first thing you do is turn off the faucet, and that's shutting down the emissions. That's preventing deforestation. You stop the emissions, and then you come in with a mop and you clean up the water that spilled all over the floor, and that's biosequestration. But you can sort of only fit so much water in your mop. This is where it breaks down a little bit, but there's a limit to how much carbon can be sequestered. So we can't just keep sequestering forever. We have to turn off the faucet and then try and mop up what is left behind. So the first and foremost thing is to keep that carbon in the ground, just like we want to keep fossil carbon in the ground. We want to keep forest carbon in the ground. to prevent those emissions, which are really devastating. The amount of carbon held in forests is so high that we really need to keep that there. And sort of then and only then do we think about adding on new carbon. That's the way I think about it anyway.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and obviously, kind of what you already mentioned in terms of um, the the impacts for tree planting in areas that have been degraded or that have been that are susceptible. That, you know, in terms of food insecurity or the tropical communities you mentioned, making sure that we can plant. So that, I guess that brings us to this right tree, right place, right community approach. And I'm wondering, as we close here, if you could just make any remarks you have around so far your involvement with the project, the data-driven approach, or, you know, you've been reviewing some of the projects that have been selected. So anything you would share for funders looking to get involved in this.
Well, I'm just really excited to see that a number of the projects that are plugging in are community-driven projects, including a number in the tropics that are replanting mangroves, that are doing silvopasture, that are doing tree intercropping efforts. So they're projects that are sort of by and of the members of those communities who want to add trees to their farming operation or their community. It's really just providing them some tools in order to be able to do so. So I'm excited to see some of the most interesting and impactful agroforestry efforts in the Americas are part of the are on the docket of potentially funded projects this year. I'm really, really enthusiastic to see that. And I work to help to recruit some of those efforts to let them know that this was a possibility. And I'm very happy to see that really nice, moving in the right direction in terms of results. I think looks great to me.
Thank you so much, Eric. Just as we close, want to make sure our funders understand what silvopasture is, because I know that's a great one.
Sure. Silvopasture is when you combine trees with grazing systems. So there's a number of different kinds of ways to do that. They might be timber trees, they might be trees that make food for the livestock, they might be trees that make food for people, or they might just be shade trees that will be there for a long time, or some combination of those things. And they might be planted themselves, or the grazing land might be managed in such a way as to permit them to naturally regenerate.
I love that, because so many people, we've kind of culturally adopted this vision that beef or animal agriculture has to look a certain way by clear cutting forests. And I love this alternative vision with silvopasture that really incorporates a more holistic view of how animal agriculture can be part and parcel of human settlements with also shade cover and beauty and trees and intact ecosystems. Thank you for that. Thank you so much, Eric. Is there anything last that you'd like to share with folks before we close?
No, I think that's great. I think I'm excited that that you all are really bringing a climate justice focus to what you do. So many of the sort of evaluation questions for the proposals really have to do with that, making sure that that resources are going to frontline communities. That's really great.
Well, thank you so much for your time.